A great soundtrack has the power to make even a bad movie somewhat decent. What's going on, guys? I'm Chris and welcome back to another video. So today I'm going through my top 10 favorite movie soundtracks of all time. And when I say soundtracks, I'm not talking about like John Williams music or Hans Zimmer's music that they compose, like not the score for a movie, but rather the songs that are compiled and put into a movie. And no songs that are actually created for the film. For example, A Star is Born has a great soundtrack, but all those songs were written and created for the movie. The same can be said for a bunch of Disney animated films. These are just soundtracks where songs that already existed were thrown into the movie to make it that much better. And before I get in this thing, be sure to hit that like button, comment down below your favorite movie soundtracks of all time, subscribe and hit that notification bell to help me reach my goal of 85,000 subscribers here on the channel, and of course, check out the Unusual Couple podcast, link down below. We have weekly episodes over there and it's always a blast. Plus my Patreon's link down below. Anything goes a very long way. But without further ado, let's dive in. So coming in at number 10 for me is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the latest Quentin Tarantino film that came out in 2019. It's a star-studded cast. Obviously, you've got Margot Robbie, Leo and Brad Pitt as the headliners, but the soundtrack is so cool. It fits this hangout vibe of movie stars, and it has just a lot of classic music. Mrs. Robinson is on here, which was made famous with The Graduate in the 60s. But then you've also got songs like Bring a Little Lovin' and You Keep Me Hanging On, which is played near the end of the movie. I could sit here and rattle off the whole entire soundtrack, but I'll spare you. The coolest part about this soundtrack is that if you go to it on Spotify or wherever you stream your music and listen to it, there's actually radio commercials like added into the soundtrack to add to that authenticity of the movie and make it feel like it's actually from the classic Hollywood era. So this perfectly accompanies this entire movie, and every song is just a banger. Tarantino, I will say, is probably the director who knows how to use music best, alongside one other in a completely different genre that we'll talk about later in this video. I would love to just sit in a car with Cliff Booth, driving through the Hollywood Hills listening to the soundtrack. My life would be complete. At number 9 on my list is The Parent Trap. The reason this is on the list is because the soundtrack is just so 2000s feel good, and it makes me nostalgic anytime I watch this movie. Especially the song There She Goes. That song, it's some weird time capsule. Like when I play that song, I'm transported back in time. And I kind of put The Parent Trap here as a placeholder for every late 90s to early 2000s banger movie that just has that comforting soundtrack in a way. I couldn't name all the songs off the soundtrack. Whenever I watch The Parent Trap, I'm always like, man, this has a banging soundtrack. The same can be said for, again, pretty much any coming-of-age sort of movie from this era. But There She Goes. If that song is in your movie, it's probably a winner. At number 8 on my list is the last time I'm talking about Quentin Tarantino, Pulp Fiction. This is yet another really cool, suave soundtrack to a movie. Obviously, you've got Miserlou, which is like the surfer song that plays as the Pulp Fiction, title card comes on screen and we get the opening credits. That has become synonymous with Pulp Fiction. Like, that song's been around for years, but when it was put in Pulp Fiction, everyone kind of directly associates it with Pulp Fiction. I know for a fact that I do. But there's a lot of other just cool songs in here as well, whether that's when Vincent and Mia are dancing at the restaurant, or even when Jules and Vincent are just having conversations in the car, there will be a cool song on the radio or in the background of a scene that just makes it feel suave. Like, Tarantino knows how to make a really cool movie, but, his writing obviously helps that out, the way he shoots the movies, but the soundtrack just enhances everything. He knows how to add to the atmosphere of a movie. It's a very fitting soundtrack. There's really no other way to describe it except cool as hell. At number 7 on my list, I've got the soundtrack for Home Alone. Now, obviously, John Williams' original score for this film, Chef's Kiss, never fails to give me chills, but the actual soundtrack for the movie features some of my personal favorite Christmas music ever. This movie features the song White Christmas by the Drifters. This is like my favorite Christmas song, and it actually accompanies the scene where we get the when Kevin McAllister uses the aftershave. Classic Christmas stuff right there. But we also have Carol of the Bells as Kevin is getting ready to set up all these booby traps because he knows it's his house. He's got to defend it. I just love me some Home Alone, and every single Christmas song in this movie is on my Christmas playlist. So I had to mention a Christmas movie here because Home Alone, near and dear to my heart. Growing up, again, I would watch this movie year-round, not even just during Christmas time. It's that damn good, and the soundtrack, some of my favorite Christmas music of all time for sure. But coming in at number 6 on my list, I've got the soundtrack for Boogie Nights. This has a soundtrack very similar to any of those Tarantino films that I just mentioned. It is a PTA film that takes place in the 70s, and it's filled with bop after bop. If you just go to Spotify and scroll through, you've probably heard a lot of these songs before. The songs, especially in the first half of this movie, are high energy and really cool songs because they're adding to the rise of this character to fame. And then in the back half, the music definitely takes a shift as it's more of the fall of the main character. The most iconic song from the soundtrack, Sister Christian, and the way that it is used, I'm not even gonna lie, it's one of the most tense scenes I've ever seen. It features Alfred Molina as this drug dealer, and John C. Reilly and Mark Wahlberg's characters like go into this room with this crazy dude, and the song's playing. I won't spoil the scene, but that is one of like the best directed scenes by PTA that I've ever seen. Like truly, when I first watched it, I was sweating. I was so anxious and nervous, and that song, perfect. Boogie Nights is a very mature movie, inappropriate as hell at times. However, the soundtrack is a certified banger. But bring us into the top 5. Do you like Huey Lewis in the News? It's the soundtrack for American Psycho. Patrick Bateman has a great taste in music. Huey Lewis in the News obviously have songs, you know, in Back to the Future, but in American Psycho, we get to hear some of their music as Patrick Bateman is about to kill Paul Allen and others. Phil Collins' Sussudio is also in this, and that song slaps on a whole nother level. Me and my friends listen to it all the time. Sussudio, it's just this weird sound. Phil Collins is a master, and like I can't even describe to you how cool this song is to just blast on your stereo in your car. The iconic song Walking on Sunshine is also in this movie, and it just adds to the dark comedy of the film. Like Patrick Bateman will be walking around in his office with like his headset on and just listening to this with the straightest face of all time. Like this movie is hilarious. It's one of the best dark comedies ever. There's horrific elements obviously and a very dark message, but the movie is so damn funny through the darkly comedic lens, and the soundtrack just adds to it. At number 4 on my list, I've got the soundtrack for Baby Driver. This is a film directed by Edgar Wright, and it is so masterful the way that music matches to every single edit in this film. Like there's an insane amount of attention to detail here, making sure every little cut or movement by a character aligns with the soundtrack of the film. In fact, the soundtrack's like its own character in the movie because Baby, the main character, has an iPod with all these songs, and he's got to have the perfect song in order to be the driver for the heist, and there are multiple moments where they make fun of that. He's obsessed with music as a whole, so there's a ton of unique tunes in this movie that I was introduced to for the first time. Not only is the opening heist badass, but the song Bell Bottoms just makes it even cooler. Then you've got a song by Queen featured in the third act of the film, and just tons of like obscure music that I myself had never heard prior to this movie, but I fell in love with the entire soundtrack when I watched it through, and it even features just such a relaxing, chill song. Easy like Sunday morning. Apologies, I can't sing, but you get the gist of it. Baby Driver soundtrack had to be pretty high on this list. But coming in at number 3, I've got the soundtrack for Forrest Gump. This is the ultimate dad rock music playlist. Like if you go listen to the soundtrack for Forrest Gump, there's Lynyrd Skynyrd, CCR, the list goes on and on, tons of classic rock bands. Like if you have a local radio station that is classic rock, for me it's 97.1 The River growing up. If you tune it to that, you basically would hear most of the songs on the Forrest Gump soundtrack. And I'm all here for it. That's one of my favorite genres of music, and like growing up I would listen to rock and roll all the time. There's some Elvis Presley on the soundtrack, you got Lynyrd Skynyrd. I mean, it spans different decades of classic rock, and I have to give it a mention here. Like Fortunate Son by CCR is in this as they're in the helicopters. Like I feel like this movie indirectly created the meme of like how every war movie has that song playing as people go to war. The Forrest Gump soundtrack, top notch, and it's just some of my favorite tunes that I've listened to outside of like the actual soundtrack. I already had a lot of them on my rock playlist already, but my runner-up, very similar in genre, is Remember the Titans. This is one of my most listened to movie soundtracks ever. It introduced me to Ain't No Mountain High Enough, which is one of my favorite songs of all time. I would sing it all the time as a kid because they played it in the locker room, and I would want to be like Alan and everyone just like shaking my shoulders, getting into it. It also introduced me to the song Venus, which is great. It's when Sunshine Ronnie Bass is like dancing in the schoolyard. Na 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 na, na 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 na, hey hey hey, goodbye. Also introduced me to that song, which I feel like everyone at some point, if you played a sport, was like chanting to the other team growing up. And then also, it's got Spill the Wine, which is also featured in the Boogie Nights soundtrack. The iconic song Peace Train is featured on the soundtrack, and Long Cool Woman in a Black Dress, which is playing while the Titans have their winning montage. That is a banger. I listen to that in my car all the time. Remember the Titans is such a formative movie for me. Like I watched it when I was 5. It's had a huge impact on my love for movies and the sport of football. And so I've listened to the soundtrack constantly over the years, and it was always going to be high on this list. But number 1, you guys probably knew before you clicked on this video, is the soundtrack for Guardians of the Galaxy, and I'm counting all 3 volumes in one. This is the first time a superhero movie really had a soundtrack play such a pivotal role, where each song kind of added to the overall scene, and the main character had this awesome mix where he could play tunes to kind of accompany each badass moment in the film. The Guardians 1 soundtrack is probably the most memorable and iconic. Like, most people probably think of that first when they think of all the Guardians music. It's definitely in that dad rock genre. You know, Ain't No Mountain High Enough, ironically enough, is on this soundtrack. But you've also got Ooh Child, I Want You Back by Jackson 5, the Pina Colada song. I mean, the list goes on with just bops. Then you move into Guardians 2 and you've got some Fleetwood Mac on there. George Harrison's My Sweet Lord. I mean, even more bangers. And then you move into Guardians 3 and that's where we had the opportunity to get a little more diverse with the music choice because there was a bigger time period to choose from within the story. Of course, at the end of the movie, Dog Days Are Over plays, and that's just such a delightful song that makes me feel so happy inside when I hear it. But you've got the Beastie Boys' No Sleep Till Brooklyn on here. You've got In the Meantime, which I was actually introduced to because of the trailer for this movie. So all three Guardians soundtracks function perfectly in their own movie. They add to the badassery of scenes and just the emotional moments of scenes, obviously, but James Gunn knows how to insert music in the right times. He's got these deep cut tracks that I myself hadn't heard a decent amount of the songs on all the soundtracks, so it was introducing me to a lot of new music, but it also just fit the character so well and made for some of the most memorable scenes. Like, the music in a scene will automatically make it more memorable, and for the rest of my life, when I hear Dog Days Are Over, I will think of the end of Guardians 3. All three Guardians soundtracks are elite, so I had to mesh them into one for the top spot on this list. But those are just my favorite movie soundtracks of all time. Let me know yours in the comments down below, and be sure to hit that like button. Subscribe and hit that notification bell to help me reach my goal of 85,000 subscribers here on the channel. Of course, check out the Unusual Couple podcast, the link down below. Weekly podcast episodes over there with myself and my girlfriend Cam. We have a lot of fun with it. But thank you guys, as always, for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys later.